A generation of American leaders, civic, political, and military, who led our country through World War II and, importantly, in the 5 years immediately after World War II, was the ablest generation of leaders in our national history since the founders. That prompts the question, how did they get that way? And what was it that summoned the kinds of talents they possessed to the national service that they provided? Excuse me again, and let me remind you also, before we talk about soldiers and sailors, of the immediate post-war generation in which, and I'm talking about 1946, the Republican Party swept into power in both houses of Congress for the first time in almost 35 years. The president was a man called Harry Truman, about whom most people knew almost nothing. And when you consider what the country did during that 5 or 6 year period after the war, basically the rebuilding of Europe, the establishment of NATO, the Marshall Plan, those kinds of things, and a galaxy of talent in the Department of State, the makers of our foreign policy, it was quite extraordinary. One of the things that those leaders had in common was service in World War II, and in many cases, service in World War I. If you were, for example, 65 in 1950, you had been born in 1885, and you probably would have served in the First World War. I taught a seminar 2 years ago at a famous Northeastern university, whose name it would be ungracious of me to mention in the light of what I'm about to tell you, and none of my bright students had ever heard of John Pershing. We are thinking very hard at the World War II Museum about our commitment to assure that 30 or 50 or 100 years down the road, succeeding generations of Americans will remember what their country did in the Second World War and who led them. That phrase, succeeding generations, was used all the time by our stoutest ally leader, Winston Churchill. Succeeding generations must not be allowed to forget what they have done here. I'm going to talk briefly about the leaders in the Second World War, and we'll have plenty of time much later in these proceedings to talk about grand strategy and all of those kinds of things. We were blessed with a great American president, Franklin Roosevelt. And it's interesting, when I lecture on this period, I frequently get angry questions about Franklin Roosevelt. People say, my grandfather told me he was a socialist and he was a traitor to his class, all of that kind of talk. That's nonsense. As a wartime leader, he is one of our two greatest in our history after the establishment of the country, the other being Abraham Lincoln. FDR was extraordinary as a leader, basically because he had an almost uncanny sense of people to appoint under him in the Navy and the Army. He had been Assistant Secretary of the Navy in World War I. He loved the Navy. He was quite close to it. But he had an enormously educated and instinctive sense about who would be the best leaders for the military. And secondly, and your parents or grandparents may have told you about his fireside chats, he held the country's hand all the time. He lifted them up. He summoned them to a common purpose. His voice was both inspirational, and not only inspirational, but it was compassionate. You might remember hearing about his prayer for the young men who were about to invade at Normandy in 1944. It's very beautiful. You've probably seen copies of it. But this was an extraordinarily effective leader, Franklin Roosevelt. Our stoutest and most stout-hearted ally, of course, was Winston Churchill. To undertake to say anything about Winston Churchill in the space of a minute or two is an impossible impossibly formidable task. He had done everything. And to give you a sense of how much he had accomplished in his life and how quite literally he was the savior of his country, as Alan Taylor called him, in 1953 in Oslo, when 3 Nobel Prizes were given, Churchill's was the Nobel Prize for Literature. The other recipients were George Marshall, the American Secretary of State, and Dr. Albert Schweitzer. Churchill's nose was said to be out of joint because he had to settle for a Nobel Prize for Literature. And incidentally, it recognized his presentation or his production of the 6-volume history of World War II, which probably your parents or grandparents or maybe you may have copies of on your bookshelves. Incidentally, somebody made this observation, but what do we have in common in our houses? It's not unusual for us of all generations to walk through a nice home of our new friends and almost invariably expect to see a picture of a handsome young man in a uniform. 16 million people who wore the uniform between 1940 and 1945, 1946. That's extraordinary. Let me take a quick detour, incidentally. We will be with the Marines later on today, but most of those drafted into the Army who served in the European theater in 1944-45 were very young, those who fought in the Battle of the Bulge. And the 2 million of them who prepared themselves in England or who were training in England before we invaded at Normandy. The British like to say they're overfed, oversexed, and over here, to which the American GIs would respond, you are underpaid, undersexed, and under Eisenhower. And incidentally, Ike was enormously popular in England. Anyway, Winston Churchill, and we could talk all day about Winston Churchill. When George Marshall returned to the United States from his ambassadorship in China in 1946, he was astonished at the sudden access of anti-Russian, anti-Soviet feeling, because in the period from 1941 to 1945, the Russians were our allies. There were pictures of Stalin on the cover of Life magazine with captions like, "Just a guy named Joe." Harry Truman said, "I have brotherly feelings towards Joe Stalin." The communists, the Russians, Joe Stalin did not become the bad guys, the evil empire, until 1946, 1947, with the onset of the Cold War. The debt in blood paid by the Soviet Union, as it was then, was astronomical. More than 35 million people killed. The American death toll, incidentally, during the Second World War was just under 400,000. Joseph Stalin. General Douglas MacArthur, I'll say a word or two about him. He was our American commander in the Southwest Pacific. And later on, he was what we might today call proconsul in Japan. You can be certain that when you read a biography of a general, famous general, who was a graduate of West Point, that with only 1 or 2 exceptions, the first sentence in chapter 2 of the biography will begin with the phrase, "Although a mediocre student at West Point, comma." MacArthur's a famous exception. He was first in his class. The other exception, would somebody like to take a guess? Robert E. Lee, also a well-behaved and successful student. MacArthur was an extraordinarily capable general. He was our leader in the Southwest Pacific. He was known not only as brave and brilliant, but also prickly and to some extent rather self-absorbed. But he led our country gallantly, and one of his so-called rivals, George Marshall, who was head of the Army, wrote the Congressional Medal of Honor citation for him after he had left Bataan and Corregidor to establish the new American command in Australia. Marshall, an extraordinary man. Churchill called him the noblest Roman of them all. Born in Uniontown, Pennsylvania, a non-West Point graduate. His father was a Republican in a Democratic stronghold. He went to VMI in Virginia, later on joined the Army, became aide-de-camp under General John Pershing, a very formidable World War I figure and leader. If you'll permit me to take a 1-minute detour, the story of how Pershing got his job is quite funny. He was married to the daughter of a Democratic senator from Wyoming. And Woodrow Wilson, who knew almost nothing about anything military, said to this Democratic senator, "Does your son-in-law, young General Pershing, does he have good French?" And the senator instantly saw where the president was going, said, "Oh yes, I feel he has excellent, oh yes, Mr. President." So Pershing finds himself commanding the first installment of Americans to arrive in France in 1917, April 1917. And he's confronted with 50,000 people, and the president of France gives an extraordinarily eloquent speech en français. Pershing now realizes with horror that he is expected to respond en français, and he knows almost nothing. But there's a brilliant aide-de-camp standing behind him who whispers in his ear, "Lafayette, nous voici." And Pershing says in French, "Lafayette, we are here." The French thought this was the choicest, most wonderful, emotional thing they had ever heard in their lives. Anyway, Pershing, it's one of my favorite stories about him. George Marshall grew up to become head of the American Army in 1939. He was known as the organizer of victory. He built the force. He did not command the force in combat, but his achievement nonetheless was extraordinary, and of course later on became our Secretary of State. Henry Stimson, a forgotten name, unfortunately, but he was our Secretary of War. In those days, we called people according to what they really did. Nowadays, we say Secretary of Defense. Henry Stimson had been Secretary of State under Hoover, and he was old enough that he had served as Secretary of War under William Howard Taft, and at the age of 51, volunteered for combat service in France in World War I and served in France at that age. Thereafter, he did not discourage people from addressing him as Colonel Simpson, Secretary of War. And in those days also, Franklin Roosevelt, in the making of strategy, dealt directly with the senior generals and admirals, bypassing the secretaries of war. Dwight Eisenhower Ike, the picture you will see of him was made somewhat later in life when he became our president. Ike is extraordinarily talented general officer and military leader. And most people don't get that. They think of him as a good and honorable and upright and sunny disposition, good man. He was an extraordinarily smart, well-educated, well-put-together intellectually leader. He was the man whom Marshall and Roosevelt selected to lead the invasion of Normandy and to lead our Allied forces in the West in their successful fight across France into Germany and to receive the surrender of the Nazi regime on the 8th of May, 1945. Dwight D. Eisenhower. Also the first Republican to carry Virginia since Reconstruction. Anybody here from Virginia? Anybody here a Republican? Ike looks pretty good to you now, doesn't he? We won't go there. Next. George S. Patton. Everyone knows General Patton through the great movie, which was made by Frank McCarthy, who had worked in the Army himself and who knew Patton. At the risk of being, I hope, not too offensive, would you like me to tell you a quick Patton story? Patton was a great general, but he was crazy. he said to the 45th Infantry Division on the morning of July 10th, 1943, at the beginning of the invasion of Sicily, and I'm using his pronunciation. I know a lot of you GIs are, a lot of you soldiers are of Italian descent. You're going to be fighting other Italians. The reason you're going to whip those Italians is that you are descended from Italians who came to the New World. They had a more vigorous and fertile blood than the ones who stayed behind. You're going to be fighting the ones who stayed behind, and they don't have a vigorous and fertile blood the way you fellas do. Yes, General Patton, well, thank you very much for your, one wonders what people must have thought. But nonetheless, a great, great general. Joseph Stilwell, the American commander in China, like so many general officers of his generation who became successful and famous, he had had a very unusual career pattern. Like most of his generation, he was born between 1880 and 1890, but they had eccentric career paths. Nowadays, you have to do one thing after another according to a kind of a prescribed regimen to become a general. In those days, the Army was so small and the command opportunities were so few, they left you alone to do pretty much what you wanted. And Stilwell served 3 tours in China. He commanded the 15th Army Regiment, but he later on was attaché. He was fluent in Mandarin. He was an accomplished linguist, a very, very fine infantry officer who had been wounded in World War I. He was our commander in China. He got crosswise with Chiang Kai-shek, as you may know, and eventually came home, died soon after he returned. A brilliant and great man who was probably in the wrong place for most of the war. We're going to talk briefly now, because our time is limited, about naval officers. If you have a chance, after you've seen the World War II Memorial and you're on the West Coast, do not fail to visit the World War II in the Pacific Memorial, which is in the Presidio overlooking San Francisco Bay. The letters after the names of most of those honored dead there are USMC or USN. It was a world war, but it was a war fought separately in the 2 main theaters of operations, one from the other. The great strategic worry at the beginning was, what if the Nazis and the Japanese forces combine probably somewhere around the Caucasus, the Persian Gulf, the Indian Ocean? We will really have our hands full. That never happened. And the closest it came, again, I have to take just a brief time out to make you think about this. If you were an 18-year-old GI and you lived through the Battle of the Bulge, unwounded and healthy, and you had continued to serve until the 8th of May, 1945, when the Germans surrendered, you would be cheering and happy and delighted, but only halfway happy and delighted, because guess what you had in store? You were going home for 15 days, and from home you were going to fly to the Mariana Islands or the Philippines to train for the invasion of Japan. We had a large cohort, upwards of 500,000 soldiers, prepared to do that when Hiroshima and Nagasaki occurred. The head of the Navy during most of that period, and I'm going to ask you to take one slide out of order, was Admiral Ernest King. We'll get back to Admiral Leahy in a minute. Admiral King was the Chief of Naval Operations and also Commander-in-Chief of the Navy. The 2 positions were combined. FDR's favorite military person. He was a tough guy. He shaves with a blowtorch, the president said. He made a number of extraordinarily apt appointments. I was at a conference about 2 months ago, and we talked about Admiral King and some of his associates in the Army and the Navy and how capable they were. And someone volunteered that in these politically correct times, most of them probably wouldn't be promoted beyond the grade of lieutenant colonel. You were frequently reading about General so-and-so had an affair with so-and-so, and Admiral King drank too much, and so on. That may be, But in World War II, those kinds of idiosyncrasies, if you want to put a nice word on them, were generally left alone by the television. There was no television, by the radio people and the news people. In other words, you could be a naughty boy, and if you were really good, you could still be promoted. Will you go back to Admiral Leahy just briefly? We passed by him. Admiral Leahy was chairman of the American Joint Chiefs of Staff. Before that, he had been head of the Navy himself, chief of naval operations, and our ambassador to Vichy, the French Quisling regime. He was an extraordinarily capable naval officer who, as chief of staff to President Roosevelt, was retained by President Truman and served under President Truman during most of Truman's first administration. Harry Truman, just to remind you, became president on the death of Franklin Roosevelt in April 1945, served out the balance of that term, and then won an upset victory over Thomas Dewey in 1948 and served until 1952. Admiral William Halsey, known as Bull Halsey, loosely speaking, you might call him the naval equivalent of George Patton. Very colorful, very tough, brilliant strategist. Admiral Halsey, because of a sudden onset of a terrible skin disease, was unavailable to lead the fleet in the first significant American naval victory, the victory at Midway in June 1942. And since he was unavailable for that, the fleet was taken over, and if you can change the slide and go all the way to Admiral Spruance, by Admiral Spruance, who was known somewhat contemptuously by flyers as a battleship admiral. He led the fleet against the Japanese, whose mission ultimately was not only to conquer or capture the island of Midway, but eventually to take over Hawaii. I want to detour again just for a moment to say something about a remarkable enemy on the Japanese side. His name was Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the Japanese Navy. He was the commander responsible for the raid on Pearl Harbor. Yamamoto was educated at Harvard. He spent 2.5 years at Harvard University as an undergraduate. During one of his summers, he drove around the United States in a jalopy. He went to places like Detroit. He returned to Washington as naval attaché in the 30s and said to his superiors, "I wouldn't do what you have in mind. You think Americans are soft. You think you can take what you want in the Southwest Pacific, the Japanese resources area, and you think after doing that, the Americans will say, let's sit down and have a parley." He said, you make a very, very bad mistake if you do that. And they made a very bad mistake and did not listen to Admiral Yamamoto, who was shot down on the direct authorization of Admiral Nimitz. And if we can go back to Fleet Admiral Nimitz, who was the American commander in the Southwest Pacific, or in the Pacific Ocean areas. Admiral Nimitz was, loosely speaking, the naval equivalent of General George Marshall. Brilliant, austere, quiet, few idiosyncrasies, just doing the job. I mentioned Marshall. The kind of person that you're dealing with was asked by Douglas Freeman, the editor of the Richmond News Leader, are you keeping a journal? Are you writing down notes as you go along? No, sir, I'm not doing that. I find when people do things like that, it makes them unduly self-conscious about what other people will think of them. I must focus my mind and my talents on getting the job done. Chester Nimitz was very much like that. A last comment about this group of extraordinary people. The State Department, between 1946 and 1950, was the beneficiary of the leadership and contributions of an extraordinary group of men. the majority of whom were from New England, the majority of whom were educated in schools and universities in New England, which today are thought of as being very quote-unquote liberal. Be that as it may, I don't know what they were thought of as being politically when these young people attended. But all of them had a very strong motivation after they left to give public service to the United States. The ethos of public service was very powerful to that generation. And here we're talking about Dean Acheson, George Kennan, Robert A. Lovett, Averell Harriman, those people who provided extraordinary service for the country. And how many people here remember their grandparents or their parents saying things to them like, "Fools' faces seen in public places. You don't allow yourself to be photographed. You don't write memoirs. You don't do anything to advance yourself. You do your job very, very well, and then retire." This group here of admirals and generals, for the most part, believed in that. And when they were called upon, they were ready. And almost all of them were children of the American heartland. It's amazing how many of them, I could have included Omar Bradley, grew up on farms. West Point and Annapolis were their way out of Dodge. So at an early age, they learned self-responsibility. They learned to do their jobs without expectation of reward. They learned to do the right thing. They learned self-reliance. So these are extraordinary people, and when we go down to Quantico later on this morning, we'll have a chance to learn about other extraordinary people. At Fort Benning, a lecture like this always concludes with a question, is there any questions? There being no questions, this lecture is concluded, and yeah, yes, sir.
Maybe slightly opposite about talking about strategic, but the George Marshall's decision for the 90th Division decision, which I think really came down in '88, about 20 those in the Pacific. So at the time of Normandy, and I think we're maybe starting to run out of infantry.
Yeah. Yes. I would like, yeah, thank you for the question. They did rely on the Soviets. The British and the Americans, by that stage of the war, the British particularly, had literally run out of infantry, and they were cannibalizing one division to get enough soldiers to fill another one. Marshall made the decision in 1943 that so far from needing 250 or 318 divisions, we could do it with a much smaller number because of our Air Force, our air resources, and particularly because of what the Soviet Union was doing on the Eastern Front. That given the freshness of our troops, which was a word he used all the time, and overwhelming resources in the air, most of them led by a Washingtonian brilliant young general called Pete Casada, remarkable ground support air resources, that would be sufficient for us to win the war. Excuse me again. It was in my opinion, a bad a bad decision, because instead of having enough divisions that we could relieve a division for rest for 2 or 3 months and then bring them back, we kept up to strength by means of replacements. What that meant was that if you landed at Normandy and you survived until the end of the war, you were in the line as an infantryman the whole time. And if somebody next to you was killed, a couple of days later you would have a replacement next to you, usually a scared 18 or 19-year-old kid who knew very little about where he was. So your question is an important one, and I think it was a bad decision on the part of Marshall. Yes, sir.
A little bit outside the focus, but can you talk a little bit about the influence and impact these military leaders had on post-war Reconstruction in the American community?
Yes. The outstanding example of that, of course, is Douglas MacArthur, who became, in effect, American proconsul in Japan. And like Robert E. Lee after the Civil War, revealed himself, I say this with great respect and even affection, to be a closet liberal. He gave women the vote in Japan, for example. He was extraordinarily well suited to that particular role. And so many of these admirals and generals after the war went to work as ambassadors or in the Department of State, that hateful Soviet foreign minister Molotov said to Marshall, "Are all of your State Department people now goose-stepping around?" Said that in Russian. And Charles Bolin, who was translating, Marshall told him what to say to Molotov. "Tell him if the purport of his remark is what I think it is, that I do not like it." And Marshall stared at him for a while. If Marshall stared at you, you just crumpled up. And yeah. Yes, sir. Yeah. Unquestionably, what we loosely call character and self-reliance. Always doing what you think is the right thing to do without undue solicitude for what other people will think of you. All of these men had that. General Lee's last sentence in his farewell to the Army of Northern Virginia: "You will take with you the satisfaction that proceeds from the consciousness of duty faithfully performed." Even if, of course, in our day, it is of dubious political correctitude. You just do what you think you should be doing, and you stick with that decision. All of these people thought that way. And that is a commodity which I think is very difficult to cultivate in the kind of culture that we live in now. Superheated. Will somebody please tell Donald Trump to stop using the word fantastic? That was a fantastic, no it wasn't, it was an acceptable talk. Stop that. Yes, sir. Yes. Yep. FDR was extraordinarily sensitive to how far the country was prepared to go. So that if you look at FDR's conduct of his office from, let's say, early 1938 until Pearl Harbor, it is almost feline in its sensing of what he can do by way of preparing the country for what he senses is going to happen. I don't think we have ever had a president as good at that as Franklin Roosevelt was. And I think probably his greatest contribution, given the fact that Pearl Harbor occurred when it did, was that he had been able to bring the country along and make the adjustments, for example, the introduction of a military draft in 1940, those kinds of things, so that we were not quite, but almost ready enough to do what we did. So that's what I would say about FDR. And this was frustrating to his senior military people. He also had a strong tendency, which was vindicated by his success, to go outside the chains of command and outside the system for his counsel and the people he talked to. Harry Hopkins drove everybody crazy except Franklin Roosevelt, for example. But our admiration and our gratitude to FDR, whatever our current political affiliation must be, unstinted. He was undoubtedly a very great man. And incidentally, his, what's the relation, Toby Roosevelt, who's on our board, great-grandson? I can't remember. Yes, ma'am. Yes. That's right. Uh, I can't say enough good things about Admiral Spruance. As many stars as anybody had, Spruance certainly deserved. I'm not certain why he was not promoted with that cohort. The whole business of being a fleet admiral, a five-star admiral, or a general of the Army, a five-star general, was basically done so that we would have the same heft in council with our British opposite numbers. There was talk about making the head of the Army a field marshal. And George Marshall said, I'm not going to be called Marshall. But when the time came, so that they would have the equivalent rank as their British and Soviet opposite numbers, Eisenhower, Bradley, Marshall, General Arnold, whom we did not talk about, the head of what used to be called the Air Corps, and Macarthur, and then the Navy, the same thing. Admiral King was very keen on that. He thought he should have 5 stars. I guess one last thing I should stress, so many of these men had very unusual and very eccentric career paths and patterns, and many of them, although not all, were what today we would call characters. Boy, he's a real character. The 1930s in the military were hospitable to the nurture and development of character and idiosyncrasy. Think for yourself that between 1920 and 1940, if you were a member of the regular Army Officer Corps or the Marines or the Navy, you not only were not promoted, but in many cases you were pushed back a rank or two from what you had attained in World War I. General Wedemeyer called the rank of a lieutenant, he called that the bar sinister. He was a lieutenant for 17 years. Nonetheless, they hung in there, and suddenly in 1941-42, they were extraordinarily capable and competent people. The American Civil War, with a couple of exceptions, was fought by the head of the local Kiwanis Club and a gang of teenagers from Michigan or Alabama. The quality of leadership in the Civil War on both sides, with, again, famous exceptions, was very poor. Here we are, this big American democracy, World War II. Right from the get-go, we had extraordinary leadership, political, civic, and military. It's extraordinary. And here is Winston Churchill. I was in England in college when he died, January 1965. Roosevelt and his contemporaries all worried about him all during the war. He's going to be dead soon. He basically lived on brandy and cigars and wine and so on. He lives another 20 years, and he's prime minister for part of them. FDR died, as you probably know, on the 12th of April, 1945, and that was the country was devastated by it. And, you know, I really will subside after I say this. There is nothing less certain in our American history than the fact that we cannot reliably infer from a president's previous career what he will be like or she will be like when he gets in the White House. We just aren't able to do that and do it properly. And here's Harry Truman as the great example. Thanks very much. Yes. Yeah. Okay. Anybody else have any questions or? Yes, sir.
Yeah, you mentioned characters. Could you talk about Stilwell versus, you mentioned Claire Chennault, which most people think
Sure.
of Tigers,
Yep.
and Chiang Kai-shek, you know, all the political, the military vis-a-vis the political decisions.
I would be glad to. That gives me a chance also to mention Wendell Willkie. Wendell Willkie was the Republican nominee in Philadelphia this time in 1940, and he lost to FDR. They became pretty good friends after the election, and FDR sent Wendell Willkie on a around-the-world goodwill trip. Probably not a wise thing to do because Wendell Willkie was a loose cannon and said all kinds of things about strategy he should not have said. He also managed, on fairly reliable authority, to seduce Madame Chiang Kai-shek, which is not the kind of thing you want a defeated presidential candidate to be doing. Madame was married to Chiang Kai-shek, who was the head of China, what we used to call nationalist China, all during the war, and before that, for some 15 years. Stilwell was sent out to be chief of staff to Chiang, and not only chief of staff, but by his own wish to be commander of Chinese forces in the field. It was a mistaken assignment on the part of, I guess, Roosevelt, but also of Marshall. He should have been in Europe leading a corps or an army. But in China, given the circumstances, that Chiang Kai-shek, although the quote-unquote ruler, really didn't control large sections of the country. He was presiding over a gang of loosely affiliated warlords. Stilwell did everything in his power to create a functioning army. He was not successful. And he was undercut severely by the president's office, Franklin Roosevelt, and a couple of the president's assistants who believed that the United States could win a quick victory in China by listening to General Claire Chennault, who was commander of the 14th Air Force, and who said, we can do this with air power. He said at one point, given some 200 bombers and medium bombers, etc., we can defeat Japan almost overnight. Chennault got crosswise with Stilwell. Stilwell eventually was fired. In those days, as you probably know, Chennault had an ally in the White House in the person, a journalist, Joe Alsop, who was FDR's second cousin. And he worked directly for Chennault, and they undercut his position. It was an unpleasant and unhappy time. Stillwell also recognized the prospective usefulness of using Mao Zedong's communist forces as allies against Japan. That did not work out very well. There are people here today, I think, maybe of a certain age, who remember China in the 50s and 60s. I was in China a couple of times on recruiting trips, and I can remember my mother saying to a friend of hers, my son is in Red China. Red China. It was Joe McCarthy and all those people. But our relationship with the Chinese during the war, through Chiang Kai-shek and with the communists, was wary at best. Yes, ma'am. Yes. That's one of the great episodes in U.S. history, isn't it? Harry Truman, an American president, who within 12 hours of hearing of the North Korean invasion of the South, determined that the United States would as we would say today, go to war to stop it. In fact, 2 or 3 weeks after the decision was made, Truman having corresponded with Macarthur, somebody said to him, "You're not going to Congress for a declaration of war. This really isn't a war, is it? What would it be? What would you call it, a police action?" And Harry Truman said, yes, that's good, a police action. If any of you is ever in politics, always remember to reframe all questions that you receive. And Harry Truman was taxed with that phrase for the rest of the war. Truman made his mistake by allowing Macarthur more latitude than he should have had. You have to remember that, excuse me again, 3 months after the Korean War began, MacArthur's status in the country, in our culture, in politics, was that of a military demigod, because he had insisted upon an invasion of the Korean port city at Incheon, mainly by the Marines. The invasion was enormously successful. Suddenly, the South Koreans and the bedraggled American forces were saved, and MacArthur then decided, we will go as far north as the Yalu River. We can reconquer all of Korea. Truman and the State Department thought that would be a very bad and dangerous mistake. Our worry, our preoccupation at that time was with Europe and what Stalin might do in Europe if we were, quote unquote, sewed up in Korea. MacArthur, at several occasions, made comments directly antipathetic to Truman's stated position of what American objectives in Korea should be. And on the unanimous advice of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, he decided that Douglas MacArthur should be relieved. And he was. Again, people of a certain age here may remember that. I remember it as a boy. This small town, bankrupt Missouri haberdasher, this jerkwater, et cetera, Harry Truman has fired the greatest soldier in American history since George Washington. It was quite something to behold. And MacArthur came home to great triumph. Interestingly, having made the decision to go north of the 38th parallel, MacArthur somehow failed to realize the possibility that the Chinese would come in great force, which they did. He met Harry Truman on Wake Island shortly after that, sort of a famous meeting. Truman noticed that the general did not salute his president. We hear all those kinds of things. And they decided that MacArthur would go back, great vote of confidence. And as for the possibility of the Chinese coming in, MacArthur said, they will never come in. If they tried it, there would be the greatest slaughter. And of course, there was the greatest slaughter, but the slaughter was equally of us and our allies. We should remember also that we fought that war under the banner of the United Nations, along with the British and the French and the Turks. We had quite a coalition, so that our decision had to be made with some reference to their reaction to what we were doing. Yes, sir. During our time period? I think, and again, at least initially, I want to restrict this to military service and government service. I think that what we call minorities, of whatever stamp, and women, should be eligible for any position that we have in the military services or in government. with this possibly significant exception, and we can talk about this also, of line infantry units in the Marine Corps and the paratroopers, units like that. And again, sticking with the women part of your question, my trouble with that very controverted topic has less to do with the fact of women than with numbers. I think of an American 101st Airborne Division company with 187 men and 3 women. There's something in me that thinks that's a bad thing. 125 men and 70 women, that makes more sense to me if you take my point. If you look at these articles about women who have completed Ranger School, and God bless them, and they deserve every good thing we can say about them, but it's always 1 or 2 who manage to do that. Every other thing in the military should be open, certainly, to women. As for minorities, again, thinking of the military, I was a company commander in the 82nd Airborne Division. Just under half my soldiers were African American. The military is way, way ahead of the rest of the country. Way ahead of the rest of the country as far as those matters were concerned. We're all friends. We rarely, I can't remember thinking about race as a criterion of anything other than friendship and comradeship. And we have a successful African-American president. I sometimes think, I'm sure many of you do as well, we somehow set ourselves up as paragons of conduct and goodness and solicitude and all those nice things in the rest of the world. What must we look like during a period of the last 2 or 3 weeks to the rest of the world? So, but my comments are probably quite similar to yours, and there's no particular expertise there. I do look back at that period right after the Second World War, and I interviewed people who were senators at that time and high-ranking military people. One of the comments I heard quite often was, "We were all friends." Senator Harry Byrd, who died 2 summers ago at the age of 98, old-fashioned Virginia Democratic, conservative Democrat. Claiborne Pell was his closest friend in the Senate, arch-liberal from Rhode Island. They thought nothing of that. What can we do for the country? I don't know where that's gone, but I sure wish we still had it. Yeah. I could have added General Bradley. Maybe I should have. Maybe I should have had General Arnold as well. The Bradley-Patton relationship was odd, to say the least, because General Patton was the senior American commander outside Ike in the North African campaign. After he had successfully reconstructed the American Second Corps, which the movie is all about, he was withdrawn after less than 2 months to prepare for the invasion of Sicily, and his successor was the man who had been his deputy, Omar Bradley. Bradley successfully led 2 corps through the remainder of North Africa and Sicily, and then Patton, as everybody knows, and the movie shows it very vividly, had his famous quote-unquote slapping incidents, which eliminated him from further promotion beyond the level of a field army. Patton admired Bradley. Ike loved Bradley, who was his classmate, and thought that Bradley would be the appropriate American to lead the invasion of Europe on the American side. Ike would be Supreme Commander, but Bradley should command the forces. And George Patton, because he was so good as a tactician and an inspirer of troops, should have a significant role, but less than that of Omar Bradley. The movie Patton, which had attained a kind of iconic status, is quite accurate in its depiction of all of those things. Particularly if you've seen the movie, the little scene in which he's talking to a group of mainly ladies, English ladies, opening a canteen. Do you remember that scene? He concludes by saying, "And since it is the evident destiny of the British and the Americans to run the world when this war is over, the quicker we get to know each other better, the better it is." Well, there was hell to pay for a remark like that. And that was the kind of thing that Patton was prone to doing. You might remember also that Patton was in England for a purpose, along with the so-called First U.S. Army Group, to make the Germans think that the invasion of Normandy was only a feint, and that the real invasion was going to come across the Pas de Calais, across the English Channel, at its narrowest point, because General Patton is there with the First U.S. Army Group. There was no First U.S. Army Group. It was all invented with teletype machines and plastic tanks and that kind of thing. So he served a very useful function even before he got to France. Patton was killed, as most of you know, at the end of the war. It's probably, one says this with compassion, probably a good thing for him. It's hard to imagine a George Patton at large in the United States after the war, what he would have been like. I mean, he said things like, you know, I'll do anything. I'll command a regiment. I got to get to Japan. I got to get, it's the only chance I have. Really? George, you really feel that way? Yes, he felt that way. Churchill, who regarded the second greatest human quality of character as magnanimity, greatness of spirit. The greatest, of course, was courage. Went out of his way twice in the House of Commons to praise Rommel. May I say across the havoc of war that I descry the lineaments of a great general, something like that. That's gone a little too far, and he paid for that. But Rommel is still a figure of some admiration in this country, and his son, you might have seen, died last year, who was the mayor of Stuttgart. The great English figure of the war, universally disliked by most of the Americans, was Field Marshal Montgomery. And I don't know how much any of you know or care to hear about that, about the politics of World War II, but it's an interesting thing to study. You want to hear just one quick last World War II anecdote? 2 million American GIs with a lot of money at large in England from the period roughly 1 January 1944 until the invasion. And you heard that wisecrack earlier, over here, etc. You're under Eisenhower. There's an English diarist called Harold Nicholson. He was probably the most fastidious man you have ever heard of. In his clothing, the way he presented himself, his freshly cut orchids in his boutonniere, all that kind of thing. He was a word somewhere between fascinated and offended by American GIs. He couldn't get over what they were like. The 3rd Infantry Division song written by General Truscott, "I wouldn't give a bean to be a fancy pants Marine, 'cause I'm a dog-faced soldier all the way. I eat a kraut for breakfast," that kind of talk. The average American infantryman was concerned when he went out in public in England, these 2 million GIs, to make people understand that he was really an accountant or a used car salesman or a medical technician or a football player and not a military person. It was a big problem for Ike because they wore the uniform with many of them with a deliberate sloppiness. Harold Nicholson, standing outside the House of Commons, remembers seeing an American GI, the British hardly knew what GI meant, government issue. He walked past him on his way to the House of Commons, and he saw this GI standing there in an ill-fitting uniform, highly wrinkled, unbuttoned, with a watch chain showing across the shirt, no haircut, his hat on the back of his head, and a cigarette hanging from his lower lip. And this person, this being, as Nicholson wrote in his journal, greeted me thus. "What do you say, Ace?" He never got over it. He never got over what Americans in general were like. But they beat Hitler. They proved themselves to be extraordinarily good soldiers when they had to be. The tactical decisions and behavior of the American High Command during what became the Battle of the Bulge was not especially distinguished, but those GIs in the late high-number divisions, the 96th Division, the 90th Division, those kind of people, they beat the Wehrmacht. They were terrific soldiers when they had to be, even though they couldn't wait to get out when they got home. And I think that's one of the reasons we have such a strong feeling for them and for that generation. And I won't rehearse the story that we tell all the time at the World War II Memorial. They embodied then, and they continue to embody and to represent, and most of them are 93, 94, 95 years old now, a quality which is now extinct in this country, namely modesty. Humility, whatever you want to call it. What did you do in the war? Well, I was in the service. That's basically all you can get out of most of them. All of us here have talked to people who've had the experience of coming across a campaign ribbon or a decoration in their grandfather or their father's drawer. What's that? Oh, it's just something I got in the war. They represent that. And for most of them, the way they have conducted themselves in their careers since is a tribute to their generation and why we call them the greatest generation. And let me fire at a target of opportunity and then I will shut up. The fact that our great famous private universities on the East Coast and on the West Coast, I mean you Stanford and you Princeton, they don't teach military history much anymore because they think it's right-wing history. If you display any interest in military history, they think, what are you, a supporter of Dick Cheney or something? And that's a very, very bad state of affairs because our kids need to know about these things.